Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Bash at the Beach 1997. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is a tag team matchup. It is Glacier teaming up with Ernest the Cat Miller versus Wrath and Mortis. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Ernest and Glacier keeping the pace of the match. But Mortis ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Wrath and Mortis. Hats off to Wrath and Mortis for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Ultimo Dragon versus Chris Jericho. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between the Dragon and Jericho, with Jericho landing multiple chops on the Dragon. Jericho then lands multiple power bombs on the Dragon as well. Jericho was keeping the pace of the match, with Jericho hitting a moonsault off the top rope on Dragon for a near fall. Dragon then gets up, hits an Acai moonsault to the outside on Jericho. Dragon then hits a Hurricane Rana on Jericho as well. Jericho then gets up, hits a Lionsault on Dragon in the middle of the ring. Dragon then gets up, hits a moonsault off the top rope on Jericho, but Jericho ultimately hits a roll-up on Ultimo Dragon, pins for the 3. And your winner of the match, and at that time still WCW Cruiserweight Champion, is Chris Jericho. Hats off to Chris Jericho for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's another tag team matchup. It is the Great Muta teaming up with Masahiro Chono versus the Steiners. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with the Great Muta and Masahiro Chono keeping the pace of the match. Scott Steiner then hits a press slam on Muta, and the Steiners ultimately hit the finish on Muta and Chono. And your winners of the match are the Steiners. Hats off to the Steiners for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a 6-man tag team matchup. It is Lizmark Jr., Hector Garza, and Juventud Guerrera versus La Parca, Villano 4, and Psychosis. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Lizmark Jr., Garza, and Guerrera keeping the pace of the match. Sonny Ono then attacks Guerrera. Villano 5 is here. Garza then ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Lizmark Jr., Hector Garza, and Juventud Guerrera. Hats off to Lizmark Jr., Hector Garza, and Juventud Guerrera for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a career match. It is Kevin Sullivan versus Chris Benoit. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Sullivan and Benoit. So Sullivan and Benoit both exchange in the middle of the ring, with Sullivan keeping the pace of the match. Sullivan then hits a devastating pile driver on Benoit, but Benoit gets up, applies his signature crossface on Sullivan, but Sullivan quickly breaks the hold. Jacqueline makes her way out to the ring, grabs a chair. Jacqueline then hits Sullivan in the middle of the ring with the chair shot. Benoit then capitalizes on this, hits a diving headbutt off the top rope on Sullivan, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Chris Benoit. Hats off to Chris Benoit for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Championship. It is Jeff Jarrett versus Steve McMichael. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Jarrett and McMichael, with Jarrett keeping the pace of the match. Jarrett ultimately hits McMichael with a briefcase. Referee doesn't see it. Pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Jeff Jarrett. Hats off to Jeff Jarrett for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's a tag team matchup. It is DDP teaming up with Curt Hennig versus Randy Savage and Scott Hall. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with DDP and Hennig keeping the pace of the match. DDP then hits a flapjack on Scott Hall in the middle of the ring. Hennig then attacks DDP ringside. Curt Hennig then walks away from DDP. Hall then capitalizes on this, hits an outsider's edge on DDP. Randy Savage then also hits an elbow drop off the top rope on DDP, pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Randy Savage and Scott Hall. Hats off to Randy Savage and Scott Hall for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ric Flair versus Roddy Piper. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Piper, with Piper unloading strikes on Flair. Flair and Piper both exchanged chops in the middle of the ring. Flair was trying to keep the pace of the match. Flair then applies a figure four leg lock on Piper, but Piper quickly breaks the hold. McMichaels and Benoit make their way out to the ring. Benoit then goes for a diving headbutt on Piper, but missed and hit Flair. McMichael then hits a tombstone on Piper for a near fall, but Piper ultimately applies a sleeper hold on Ric Flair. And your winner of the match by submission is Roddy Piper. Hats off to Roddy Piper for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Bash at the Beach 1997. It is Lex Luger teaming up with the Giant versus Hollywood Hogan and Dennis Rodman. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Hogan and Rodman keeping the pace of the match. Nash makes his way out to the ring dressed as Sting. Nash then attacks the Giant, and then Lex ultimately applies the torture rack on Hogan. And your winners of the match are Lex Luger and the Giant. A couple things I'm going to say about Bash at the Beach 1997 before I get out of here, man. It was a solid event. I'm not going to sit here and say it was the best WCW event I've ever seen, but damn sure not the worst. There was a couple matches on this card that I actually enjoyed. Number one was the Cruiserweight Championship matchup between Ultimo Dragon and Chris Jericho. Solid match, with Jericho getting the victory over Ultimo Dragon, and at that time retaining the Cruiserweight Championship. That was a solid matchup. The Great Muta and Masahiro Chono teaming up against the Steiners. It was a great match to see. Obviously, Great Muta, absolute legend, as well as Masahiro Chono. But it also goes to show you at that time that WCW was also working with New Japan Pro Wrestling. So it was great to see guys like Chono and Great Muta come over to WCW to put on a fantastic match. With that being said as well, the six-man tag team matchup, Lizmark Jr. teaming up with Hector Garza and Juventud Guerrera versus La Parca, Villano 4, and Psychosis. Kind of goes hand in hand with what I just said about the Muta and Chono match against the Steiners. It was great to see that Eric Bischoff and his team was still working with AAA. I think AAA had a lot of very, very good talent. I was happy to see that they were still, that Bischoff was capitalizing on that and showing them on a platform like WCW and a pay-per-view platform such as Bash at the Beach 1997. So, again, it was great to see that, WCW was having a working relationship at the time with AAA, and bringing in the names such as Lizmark Jr., Garza, Juventud Guerrera, La Parca, rest in peace to La Parca, Villano 4, as well as Psychosis. And it made for a great match, in my honest opinion. Kevin Sullivan versus Benoit in a career match. It was a solid match. It was a great storyline, man. I mean, you want to talk about one of those storylines that really brought in some realism as far as storyline base is concerned into pro wrestling. I mean, can't get any more, more realistic, if you will, between Sullivan and Benoit. Obviously, Sullivan and Benoit had a lot of history, especially when it pertained to Kevin Sullivan's, girlfriend at the time, woman. Obviously, her and Benoit got together years later, got married, had a family, and, so on and so forth. But there was legitimate heat between both Sullivan and Benoit, and I think WCW and Eric Bischoff capitalized on the real-life drama between Sullivan and Chris Benoit. So, just made for a great storyline, and honestly made for some really good matches for WCW at that time. A couple other matches on here, too, that were interesting. DDP teaming up with Curt Hennig versus Randy Savage and Scott Hall. I think on commentary, they were saying that this was Curt Hennig's first ever WCW match at Bash at the Beach 1997, with him teaming up with DDP. And it was also crazy to see Curt Hennig turn on DDP and attack DDP in this match. Curt Hennig is an absolute legend. One of the best Intercontinental Champions of all time, in my honest opinion. And honestly, could have been multi-time world champion as well, in my honest opinion, too. So, it was a great match. Like I said, it was cool to see DDP teaming up with Curt Hennig. Piper versus Flair, again, great match. Two of the all-time greats, Hall of Famers. And Honestly, Ric Flair and Piper could have main evented any card for any company at that time, in my honest opinion as well. But Piper ended up getting the victory over Flair with a sleeper hold. So it was a solid match. And again, two absolute legends in professional wrestling. And then the main event. Lex Luger teaming up with the Giant versus Hogan and Dennis Rodman. I'm not going to sit here and say that this event was all based around the main event. I think it obviously had a lot to do with it. And, seeing Dennis Rodman in a wrestling capacity or just in a match alone was absolutely insane. Obviously, at this time, this is when, Dennis Rodman was in the NBA. Chicago Bulls was a primetime team back then in the NBA, and Dennis Rodman was a part of that team as well with Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen and those guys. So obviously there was a lot of publicity, a lot of eyeballs with this match, especially pertaining to Dennis Rodman being in the house and in a match with Hollywood Hogan. So it brought a lot of eyeballs to the product as far as WCW is concerned. But for what it's worth, I mean, Dennis Rodman, was he a great wrestler? No, I'm sure he was a humongous fan at that time. But the one thing I will give him is that the arm drag that he landed on Lex Luger was probably one of the best. I can't sit here and say it was one of the worst arm drags I've ever seen. There's a lot of professional wrestlers that have arm drags that are a lot worse than what Dennis Rodman did to Lex Luger that night at Bash at the Beach 1997. So I will give Dennis Rodman credit for that. With that being said, though, there's a lot of athletes that are from different sports that come into professional wrestling and do a fantastic job and have a hell of a career for themselves. Even in WCW, I mean, you look at Steve McMichael. I mean, played for the Chicago Bears, great defensive player. And for what it's worth, I think he had a really good, solid career for himself in WCW. Aligning himself up with the Four Horsemen and allowing guys like Ric Flair and Arn Anderson to kind of let, take McMichael under their wing and kind of, teach him the ways of professional wrestling. And I think it paid off for McMichael. I really do. I think McMichael had a really solid career in WCW. And for what it's worth, I think, there's a lot of other wrestlers that wrestled for WCW that, got the proper training that really didn't pan out too well for him in their in-ring career, such as McMichael did. And he came from a, professional football background. So kind of tells you what kind of, athlete that McMichael was, how much of a fan he was of professional wrestling, and what he was willing to do for the business. So you got to give a lot of respect to McMichael for that, and for that alone. So, but all in all, the main event was a solid match. But Lex Luger and the Giant ended up getting the victory over Hogan and Dennis Rodman. But like I do for every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10. 1 being the worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give WCW's Bash at the Beach 1997 a solid rating of a 5.5 at best. But this is my review of Bash at the Beach 1997. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.